Just a couple of words about my background, which I'm only going to mention in case that it helps to understand where it comes from, what I will be talking about. I am an engineer. We were talking about engineers early in the morning. I am an engineer. I have a master's in chemical engineering, but never worked as an engineer. I moved on to study the social sciences first. I got a degree in technology policy, and then I studied the humanities, history of technology, but also sociology of technology. And in recent years, I'm also specializing in a field known as science technology society or science and technology studies. I like the first definition better because it has society in it. The second is a bit more technocratic. And it's an interdisciplinary field that takes advantage of the historical, sociological, anthropological, philosophical study of science and technology in order to argue that technology is not neutral and science is also not neutral. It may be objective, but its objectivity is socially situated. As far as we are concerned here, my introductory comment would be that in 2023, with the country where I come from being hit by fires just as we speak from Athens, the last mountain around Athens is being burned, the mountain of Parnitha, up to the Evros region, the borders between Greece and Turkey. Everything is on fire. Just as it was in Spain and Portugal, Spain in particular, early in the spring, everybody saw it coming. In 2023, I don't think we can talk about science and technology as being irrelevant to the environmental crisis. I don't see how someone can do that. And I will argue that the way that science and technology have been reconfigured in the context of capitalist modernity has been key to understanding the environmental crisis and what we're experiencing right now. And not only, I would argue that the ideology of the neutrality of science and technology has been hegemonic ideology. Hegemonic ideology is hegemonic because it is not being disputed. It is the hegemonic ideology that made possible to arrive at the present situation, to arrive at this critical point in history, to produce this unprecedented environmental crisis. Farther in the same direction, the main point of this interdisciplinary field, Science Technology Society, STS, is that the technical is social. And it's not social because it depends who is the user of technology. It's not social because a good guy can use technology in a good manner, a moral person, whereas an immoral person may use it in a bad way, in an immoral way. But independently of how good or bad a person might be, technology by its very design from the beginning comes with determinations. It helps, it ushers certain social scenario, it facilitates, it privileges certain directions, just as it is against the design of technology certain other scenario. So my argument here, the argument that I want to share with you, my working hypothesis, is that it's not the bad use of technology or science for that matter that is responsible for the environmental crisis that we are dealing with, but it's the very design of science and technology. The world is full of engineers who are very moral persons, full of scientists, physicians, mathematicians, biologists, who are very moral persons. I'm sure some of you come with this background. They're not bad persons. They care, many of them, as much about the environment as you do. The problem is that the very habituation to a certain way of thinking through science and to a certain way of constructing things, designing things through technology, has made them do things that have consequences that they cannot think about. That's the problem that I encountered as an engineer, and I decided to move to the social sciences. That engineers and scientists they design objectively, they think that they do good things, but their very education is tailored to not understanding, to not helping them understand the social dimensions of what it is that they design. And more specifically, it doesn't help them to understand the environmental dimension of their design. I'm going to talk about all this not through general examples, but I'm going to focus at what may be at the heart of the reasons, of the causes for the environmental crisis, meaning what we call energy and energy technologies. Energy has been at the heart of the environmental crisis. This hardly needs any arguing, and we'll see over the course of my presentation, I think, why this is the case. Now, being an historian, of course, I believe that policy, I'm not going to use the word solutions, considerations, policy problematizations, have to be contextualized historically. Because history is not about the past. History is about the present and the future. We decide what to study in history, and we decide how we are going to study it, and we decide which sources we are going to study based on present concern and the way we see things now. So when I talk about history and historiographical observations, of course I mean that I'm going to go over things that have some relevance to the policy issues that are with us. And more specifically, the issues that have to do with the hopeful transition to renewable energy. I don't know if my message is pessimistic or optimistic. I was asked about it over the break. It certainly is not an easy one, because I will specifically invite us to consider the very definition of renewability and therefore sustainability as well. We heard so many useful things over the course of the morning sessions about energy justice, for example, about energy communities. The question to me, as I said, combining the technical and the social and treating them as inseparable, is beyond desires, beyond political preferences. How do we actually design technologies, techniques, technological realities? Thank you. The question is, how do we come up with technological materialities, technical materialities that are truly renewable? In several of your questions earlier today, I listened a concern about this. It was indirect when the talk was about not in my backyard or in my backyard. That was also a present issue. You will see examples of versions of materialities, energy materialities, that were very much welcomed by certain people, and versions that were not all that welcomed. What I'm trying to say in this introduction is that the very definition of renewability is, in my opinion, a question. Many things are being reproduced according to the traditional environment-destroying technologies in the name of Green Deal and transition to sustainability and all that, precisely because we don't approach the very definition of renewability critically. So this is what I'm going to focus on. I will try to finish my presentation as soon as possible so that we have as much time as needed for discussion. For those of you who may have any suggestions, points that you want to share with me after the presentation, in the following days, weeks or so, this is my email. You can also Google my name and find it, and I would be delighted to have your concerns shared with me. And to the degree that I can, I will reply back. We'll come back to the abstract later. Let's take the story from the beginning. At the start, at the period of the launch of the merchant capital, Renaissance, Baroque, what we call the merchant period of capitalism, we have the appearance of an ideology, an imaginary of replacing humans by machines at the stage scene theater of history. This is unheard of. When Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Shakespeare were writing theater, they were writing theater by considering a fact, it was a given, that it is humans that make history. And theater was an education to education to citizens of classic Athens, not Hellenistic Athens, not Roman Athens, classic Athens. The brief experiment with democracy period was an exercise on how to train citizens, unfortunately then, just free white men, no women, no slaves, but nevertheless a body of citizens much larger than in oligarchy or when you had a king, a few thousand free men. They were trained on how to become better citizens through theater. With the appearance of merchant capital, as I said, the Renaissance, Baroque, we see a movement throughout Europe, which is depicted here. This is one of the many books that some, let's call them early engineers, were drawing. They were making drawings of imaginary machines, mechanisms would be more correct, which they were trying to sell to the powerful men of the day by arguing, and that was the front cover, that was the front page, by arguing that what we need is a world where machines, machinarum, will be what will determine history. This is theatrum machinarum novum, new theater, not like the ancient or medieval theater. This would be a world where history will be made. You can see the stage of history being opened, and this world will be made by machines, mechanisms. This is all around us. When we talk about technology using active verbs, the idea that technologies make history, what is being called technological determinism, the idea that technical programs spontaneously amounts to social progress, goes back to this period. And it's very interesting that if you look actually inside this new world, everything that you will see is what later on, at the period of industrial capital, these are just mechanisms, but in the period of industrial capital, the 19th century mostly, will be called energy technologies. In the foreground, you can see some water mills, and in the background, these little X's. Looking in the far and the most distant point, on the top of hills, you see some little X's. These are windmills. So the windmills and the water mills are presented, and their mechanism as the future. So the future will be made by mechanism, by what we now call technology, and central to this will be energy. That's how it all started. It's a book that collects some of them. An example of what you could see in these books and these drawings. One of the devices of the mechanism that they were trying to sell. Let's call it air conditioning. Okay? Or hypertext. From that point on, up to the present, and some of the things that we see around are that old, the idea of a coherent text that you read from the beginning to the end is over. You just have many books, many text opens, you go around the same way we navigate through hypertext over the internet and the web. Now, with the launch of industrial capitalism, we have the emergence of machines proper, of constant capital, as Karl Marx would call it, as opposed to variable capital, which would be humans. We have then, and only then, the appearance of concepts energy. There is no such concept before. Only in the 19th century, with the advance of industrial capitalism and the diffusion of machines like the steam engine, this concept appears. Newton does not have in his vocabulary, in his physics, go back to your school days and your introduction to school physics. Newton does not have in his laws of kinetics, does not have a concept of energy. Energy is a concept that appears with industrial capitalism, and we will see why. But more importantly for this group, the very concept of the environment does not exist in the antiquity, does not exist in the Middle Ages. It appears only when machines proper, like the steam engine, and we will see a drawing now, appear. The environment is what is outside the machine, outside a place controlled by machine, as opposed to what is inside. For the ancient Greeks, for the ancient Aristotle, there was no differentiation. There could be materially no differentiation between an environment and what is inside. It's only with the invention of machines, and we will immediately see why, that this concept is being introduced. We just start to learning this through some wonderful work by environmental historians and historians of technology, that this concept too, just like the concept of energy, is an historical one. And I'm sure you have all heard these very strange laws, axioms of thermodynamics, which also appeared in the 19th century, not before, versus the laws of Newton, with the second law of thermodynamics assuming that while energy, whatever this energy thing may be, it remains the same throughout processes, but its quality is going down, is degraded. It was a big problem in the middle of the 19th century. What are we going to do now that we know that the quality of energy is, that energy is degraded? The answer is interesting. God is merciful, and when the time will come that the quality of energy will be so bad that there will be no life on Earth, He will take care of this. I'm not kidding. This is work by professional historians. The key figure here was Lord Kelvin, who was one of those who introduced the concept of thermodynamics. Let's make all this abstract concrete. First of all, recall how in the period of the Renaissance, there was the new theater of machines. This trend continued on, and by the time of the 18th century, the stage included the one and only and paradigmatic since then engine, the steam engine. That's from an 18th century drawing in Sweden, actually, from Sweden. When one was looking at a steam engine, and all our energy engines follow this model from the outside, could see only the humans feeding it with coal, some version of fuel, and on the other side, a motion that was uniform, controllable, that did not depend for the first time ever on nature. The caprices of nature, the variability of nature, the unpredictabilities of nature could no longer be an issue in a world that would be full of machines. Here we see an open view of it. You see a cat. In reality, what one could see was the input and the output. The rest was concealed, black boxed, as the engineer said. That's the concept of the black box. When you see only the input and the output, but you don't know how this takes place. In this particular case, coal, heat, for the first time ever, is somehow related in a mysterious way with motion. It's the first time in human history, with the appearance of machines and industrial capitalism, that heat and motion can appear as two versions of the same phenomenon, thermodynamics. Newton's, as I said, physics don't have such a thing. It's just motion, kinetics, dynamics. And the whole idea here is that these two different things up to them are expressions of the same thing, and therefore the new concept by 1850, energy. There was no such concept before that. Energy remains the same, but its quality drops. We are being taught this as a law of nature in schools. in our school physics. It's not a law of nature. Ancient Aristotle and Plato and all these guys were not less intelligent than Lord Kelvin and the UK and the British engineers and scientists of the 19th century. It's just that there were machines by then. By the 19th century, there were machines that would allow you to talk about this as a law of nature. And the big problem with a school education is that it presents a law of industry, a law of machines, a law of industrial capital, a law of capital. It normalizes it. It presents it as if it is a law of nature. Out in nature, as we very well know from how the trees operate and all that, there are no such processes. This is a law of capital. And it's a law that describes the degrading of energy due to industrial processes. Now, why are humans, for the first time ever, through the use of some machines, supposedly independent of nature? What do we see in the background that we now also associate with energy? In contrast to this wonderful motion of the machine that only depends on feeding with fuel, with coal, in the background we see sails. That's how people were moving up to then. We see a boat. Okay? As we know from Agamemnon and these guys and the Iphigenia story, there may not be good weather, there may not be good wind. There is wind one day and no wind the following day. Nature was determinant. Whereas with industrial capital, supposedly, human societies, capitalist societies, no longer depend on nature. This is a very ideological contrast. That on the one hand, you have something, nature and wind, a version of energy that depends on the unpredictabilities of nature, whereas on the other hand, through some magic way, imagine this being a black box. That's how all machines are. They have a displayed part and a concealed part. We have an input and an output. We don't see the inside. Here we have the ideological presentation of the first machines, the steam engines, which were called also fire machines, as being independent of nature. This is also the period that's also very interesting, that the words science and technology were introduced. There's no science, concept science in the antiquity. Even Newton and Boyle and all these guys of the period of what we now call scientific revolution were called natural philosophers. They were philosophers, just philosophers of nature, as opposed to being philosophers of God, theologians. The term science was introduced together with the diffusion of steam engines and the factory system in the course of the 19th century, through the establishment of industrial capitalism. Same with the concept technology. The ancient Greeks don't have technology. The ancient Romans don't have technology. All medieval societies don't have technology. Not even the early modern capitalist societies, merchant capital, have technology. They have techniques. Look at the steam engine once again. You have a transformation of state from heat to motion. That's not reversible. Whereas with a mechanism, you can have reversibility. These processes are irreversible. It would be another story, but many important theories from ecological economics, Georgescu-Reagan is the best known of them. That was in the 60s and the 70s, together with the movements, the social movements around the globe, introduced the idea that the laws of thermodynamics need to be studied more carefully, precisely because they came at the moment where industrial capital was established. And the interesting thing is that Georgescu-Reagan connected this to the idea of ecological economics, the possibility of ecological economics. It's not accidental that all these concepts, together with the concept environment, appear at the same time with industrial capital. In order to understand what's specific about the environmental crisis, I think it's natural to say that first we need to understand what the concept of the environment is all about and when it did appear. You all know of this guy in a very thoughtful manner. That's a portrayal, a ideological portrayal. He looks at the steam engine that we just looked at. That's James Watt. And supposedly he uses science to improve it. How did he improve it? he introduced a mechanism, the little mechanism with the two little balls that you see here. And the idea was, let's not care about when we put the coal on the one side of the engine, get as much motion as possible on the other side in order to move the machines of a factory. Let's not worry about this only. Let's worry about control of the workers. How do we care about control of the workers? By making sure that the motion at the factory, the motion here at the wheel that moves the various tools, machines at the factory, would be uniform. Meaning, if one version of a coal has less heat than another version of the coal, which means that the steam engine will start going fast or slow, or if a worker who feeds the machine with coal is lazy, or he is part of a labor union or whatever, and he does not feed regularly, then the engine will start going fast or slow. As soon as this starts, the machines at the factory will start breaking. For example, the threads to produce clothes. So it's important to have uniformity. So the idea of James Watt was, let's introduce a mechanism that when the steam is too much in the engine, some of it will be released in the environment. The release of the steam on the environment will automatically result in lowering the motion. Why? When there is too much steam, the two balls are moving fast, going up and open up automatically the valve with the steam. The steam goes out, then the motion goes down, and the two balls go down. How do we call this? It was called the steam engine governor. In ancient Greek, cybernetics. The technical term, negative feedback, self-regulation, control. You were willing to sacrifice part of the energy, unheard of up to then, in order to have better control. To whom? To the workers. Okay? Automation. The term cybernetics, does it remind you something? Cyber. Cyborgs. In the 1940s, Nobel winner takes the example of the steam engine governor as the par excellence mechanism of cyber and produces the term cyber organism, cybernetic organism. All this, as we can see, go back to this period. Now, why are all these important? Because for two reasons, two things were overlooked in this process. Let's start with the most difficult one. When this thing starts working, within certain limits, yes, there could be a regulation and control of the motion. What if there is too much heat, too much steam? Where will it be released? To the environment. So there are two ways by which all machines, all energy machines, interact with the environment, and more precisely, they create an environment. They assume that there is an environment that we don't care about. There is a control space where we care about uniform motion, and an environment, therefore the introduction of the concept, that we don't care about, to which we can do what? Channel the steam, the exhaust, the waste, in two ways. The formal one that we are all familiar with, let's exhaust as much as possible, the burning of the fuel, and this one, which is actually important, because no automation can protect you from more extreme scenarios. Automation, feedback, self-regulation, control is within certain limits. Then, exhaust again. And I'm staying a little more on the cybernetics part, because these days we hear so much about us being saved from the environmental crisis by introducing smart grids, intelligent technologies, artificial intelligence, negative feedbacks. That's what all this is about. Appropriating the so-called ICT in the context of energy machines in order to save the environment. The reality is that historically, an environment was created. The inside, the controlled industrial space, the controlled homes, everything, the controlled laboratories, and the outside. The thing that philosophers of technology, following Martin Heidegger, he's not my favorite philosopher, but I like this concept. How does he call the environment? It's a very familiar concept. An endless reservoir. It's a reservoir where you can channel all the waste or the exhaust because it is endless. When I was a chemical engineering, now when I go back to my chemical engineering handbooks, I laugh, I enjoy, but I also become very sad when I see that they say, design this chemical engineering plan and assume that there is an endless reservoir out there. That's exactly how they say it. So engineers, good guys, are being trained to the idea from within, internally, from their very education, that there is an environment which is an endless reservoir. And when we take pieces, black boxes, and build machines, build circuits, build networks, we don't really need to care about this endless reservoir. You see it here. That's how it started. An endless reservoir in transportation. From this to all-day, present-day cars. We'll come back to electric cars. Then in sailing. And then the world fairs, the world exhibitions, going back to the Crystal Palace, 1851. From there until present-day computer exhibitions, organizing special events, that's the famous Crystal Palace in England, in the UK, in London. The king went there to promote the idea that the machines exhibited inside are indeed the makers of history, and that's all that mattered. So the expansive, let's go a step farther. Let's go quickly towards more recent machines. Okay, that's the steam engine, but we don't have steam engines now. We have dynamos. What is a dynamo? An electric generator. An electric generator is just a steam engine with long, very long chains. Something like this. As it happened, I had the opportunity, I think I was very lucky that I had the opportunity to study some engineering textbooks from the 1870s and the 1880s. That was about when Thomas Edison was considering building in downtown New York at Tribeca, beautiful place for vacation. That's where he built the first electric power network, electric power transmission. It was actually a distribution, electric distribution network, but let's say it was the first electric network. At the time, the engineers were describing indeed the unknown electric dynamo as a steam engine with lock rows. And if you think about it, that's what it is. And so is the hydroelectricity and all versions of energy machines that either rely on fossil fuels or hydroelectricity. Keep this picture in your mind, because my argument would be that the presence or absence of long-distance transmission lines network is critical in start defining renewable energy proper. Aesthetics, idealizations of the long-distance transmission network. Let's start with nuclear energy. Long-distance transmission network through somewhere in the Soviet Union. You all know this, I don't need to spend time on this, that our energy regime, the traditional extractivist based on fossil fuels energy regimes, depends on long-distance transmission. We are going to focus a little on how wind energy, on two versions of wind energy, one that reproduces this and one that may be different. By way of introducing to this just briefly, look at the contrast between an advertisement of wind energy by the Greek power company to the left, an innocent young girl holding a whirlwind. That's what wind energy is. A source of energy, the wind just blowing something, a wind turbine. and to the right. You never see on these advertisements the long-distance transmission network that wind energy of the industrial kind is relying on, and where the electrons are being mixed. The nuclear ones from the Bulgarian, from the Romanian, for example, nuclear reactors, to the ones produced, they are being fed on the Greek network, for example, which supposedly has no nuclear electricity, and they are being consumed together with electrons from wind farms. For the time being, for the moment, just keep the contrast that nuclear energy is presented as something that has to do only with the wind, no technology. And therefore, that justifies the introduction of a very ideological term. We say wind energy, help me, wind energy sources. This ideology is being reflected on the dominant concept in the 60s and the 70s, when there was a social movement, from the US to Europe to France, that was challenging, to a great extent, capitalism. These were called alternative energy, soft energy. Now, we talk about wind energy sources. My hypothesis is, and we've actually done quite a lot of research on this, that this is the case in order to justify conflating the sources, which may be renewable, with the actual technologies, which include the long-distance transmission network of the conventional kind, so as the two appear interchangeable. More on this also soon. But first, let's look a little at the reality of traditional energy, and I have a reason for focusing on this. During the last year, the EU Commission voted, and there were no significant opposition, that the nuclear energy is, they didn't dare to say renewable, but they said sustainable. Okay? And then followed the war in Ukraine, with the largest nuclear plant in Europe being in the middle of the war, and nobody knows what's going to happen. So much so about the argument about sustainability, they keep it on the side for the time being until the war will be over. How can you say that the energy that is the epitome, the apex of the fossil fuel regime, how can we think of it as sustainable? Very easily. We exclude what, again, engineers say, the front end and the back end of the nuclear cycle. The one end is the waste. Ask the people off the coast of Africa, many areas, how renewable and sustainable wind energy is when the European waste of the burnt fuel goes there and being deposited. Also, go and study, it's concealed for the time being, some people related with the mafia, the Italian mafia in the Mediterranean, who under a different context, reported that the nuclear companies of Europe were paying, subcontracting the removal of waste to one company, then second company, the third company, and the fourth company was the Italian mafia. And was taking the barrels and dropping them even in the Mediterranean and some of the deepest points. So it's not just a story about Africa, or in the cases like here. Let's assume that there is no colonialism involved, and the waste is being deposited somewhere in the first world. For how many years? For how long? What kind of risks does this represent in periods of conflicts and tensions? Do we take this into account when we say that nuclear energy is sustainable, not to say economic and competitive? Similar picture. The other end. For many years, still I think, there is a committee of nuclear countries being formed by the usuals, the US, France, USSR, Russia. Who was excluded? For example, South Africa. Why the case of South Africa is important? Because we know from wonderful stories by Gabriel Hecht, he is now the president of the Society the International Society of Historians of Technology, that the conditions of extraction of the uranium fuel in South Africa were so terrible. People were exposed to the extraction of uranium, knowing, not them, knowing the companies and knowing everybody, including the scientists and the engineers in the First World, that it was a terrible thing. Yet they were doing it because it was the only condition that would allow for the uranium to be appropriated in the First World, in the so-called nuclear countries, economically. The statistics about the death, forget about it. So it's only on the condition that we ignore that we have third world conditions in the extraction of the fuel, the fossil fuel uranium, that it became possible for nuclear energy to be presented as competitive in the First World. If the salaries to be paid to these people and the safety conditions and the environmental regulations were the same as Germany, France, or the US, we would have never started considering the nuclear energy competitive. As for the sustainability, I don't think I need to say more. And we are studying what exactly the EU said and wrote when it voted to consider it as sustainable. Of course, all these things are being excluded. And one parenthesis. Again, I said I'm not optimistic or pessimistic. I'm just said that things are not easy. I don't want to do it now, but if we had the time, we should have done it. Go to the International Nuclear Power Association portal and read the first page. You will think that you read the first page of the most radical environmentalist group that there is out there. There is environmental crisis, there is this, there is that, and then somehow towards the end they say nuclear energy is the solution. Things are not easy, and that's exactly we need to look into the details of these materialities that have to do with nuclear energy. Again, the same author, Gabriel Hecht, since we have time, plenty of time, let me just mention this story. It's not here. She studied the design of nuclear plants in France in the 1950s. Nobody knew what a nuclear plant would look like. And she discovered that there were two teams, one by the public power company and one by a military group. And then she looked at the design of the two, and they are different. The power company guys assumed that uranium would be just one more fuel, so they tried to use as much as possible. The military guys, the military engineers, did something very different. They said, okay, we always need control. If you are a military engineer, you need fire control. That's what your textbooks say. So the black boxes that they used to design the nuclear plant included a heavy cost. They used a good part of their budget, same budget in both cases, in order to design a mechanism. We don't see this mechanism, it's a black box, that allows you to remove the uranium before it's fully burned. Why? Why in the world you don't want to burn fully the fuel? Recall what we said before about the steam engine governor? In order to have control. Because if you control the burning of the uranium, the half-burned uranium is, help me, plutonium. And what is the plutonium? The fuel of nuclear weapons. So without discussing this in any parliament, without even the Prime Minister de Gaulle knowing what was going on, the one group, just by the very design of technology, which was concealed black box, could advance a future for France that would favor the use of nuclear, the availability of nuclear weapons, without the citizens ever deciding about it. And we're talking about France, the model of democracy then and now. And we're talking about this going back to the major point that I'm trying to share with you, that technology is not neutral. And technical decisions by engineers at the design level may affect greatly the future of a country, of a society like France, of mankind in general. And that's why it's very important when we say, for example, energy communities. Energy communities doing what? with big wind farms or with small, decentralized one. More on this again soon. All this about traditional energy, of course, had its own ideology. Watt was presented as a very thoughtful engineer, a scientific engineer. We now know how much his business partner, Boulton, was obscuring certain facts and was presenting him as a genius. 100 years later, electricity comes into the picture. This is the book of reference. Michael Faraday is lecturing about electricity at the main room, the main amphitheater of the Royal Society, showing the prospect of electricity, of the dynamo. Underneath, in the basement, an army of invisible technicians trying to manufacture what he is going to show at the floor above. There is obviously clearly a labor dimension here connected to the energy issue. Faraday again. The other person, Thomas Edison, he's doing experiments on stage again. Technology is also theater. Technology is theatrology, unavoidably. In order to argue against long-distance transmission of electricity, meaning high current, alternating current, as opposed to his current, which was direct current. In this case, he was conservative, eventually, next to Tesla. I think there is something about Tesla in the context of the event. And more importantly, Westinghouse, who wanted very long-distance transmission. At the time, he wanted shorter transition. This is, in our textbooks, this is the difference between direct and alternating current. In our school textbooks, they are presented that these are two different fruits, bananas and oranges. And you just choose between the two, and the one is definitely harder, the bananas versus the juice of the oranges. That's not the case. The choice between direct and alternating current is a choice which ought to be social on the distance that you want to transmit electricity. By contrast, our books and our physics tell us alternating current is more efficient in general. Again, they normalize what is the social priority in capitalism, the long-distance transmission. Just keep the fact for the time being that all other species, again, in 2023, you have to care about other species. At the time, were victimized because they were put on stage, they were putting electrodes next to them to see which one was more tortured and will kill them faster. All kinds of animals, from dogs to horses. So electricity and Edison's light hear many voices. One public, one private, and we'll come back to this. This is more important. 1950s again. Nuclear energy. It's the period, I mentioned this before, in the States and in Europe, where everybody, under the propaganda of the army, which has used nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, wants to legitimize their use and presents nuclear energy as appropriate for civilian purposes. Here, you see people in the States paying money, going to Las Vegas in order to enjoy the nuclear explosion. I'm only mentioning this as an indication of how much our societies, we're not very different from this society, are ideological when it comes to all these things. Who knows how many technologies out there, from genetic modification, from CRISPR, from are being treated the same as exotic life-savior technologies, technologies that will create the future because they are neutral and all that. Here we see this with a paradigmatic energy technology, be that fossil fuels in the nuclear form. Let's go to the most challenging and interesting part. Just give me a second. Okay, we know we don't want these things. I would assume that most everybody, if not everybody in this room, agrees that there is a problem with the traditional fossil fuel regimes. But what do we want a transition to? How we may refine renewability, sustainability? Wind energy is actually very old. It's not new. Look at these three pictures, from the transitions from the Middle Ages to merchant capitalism, from Hieronymus Bosch and others. The windmill is at the center of the stage. They very clearly understand that there is something new here. In fact, I may add this, it was considered a revolution because, unlike the water mills, which existed from older, much older, but they belonged to the owner of land, in other words, the nobility that were the owners of the land, so they were a symbol of energy associated with the feudal order, with the Middle Ages. Windmills could be placed on free spaces, public spaces, and therefore they were symbolic of a new world, merchant capital. Just keep for the time being that wind energy has been around for very old. My wife comes from an island in Greece, the island of Chios. It was a colony of Genoa. And I very much enjoy when I go to a small museum there in a valley, it's called Campos, that the Genovese rulers had built. A gravure, a drawing from one of the European observers from 1570 that shows a big number of windmills together with a sea full of sails. It was a wind civilization. So it's not that wind energy is coming without a past. And I suggest that we study this past in order to see what exactly, to get help while we're looking for the most appropriate technologies for the future. There is Hollywood, and then there is Hollywood. Hollywood can be good, it can be bad. There was a period immediately after the World War II where some major Hollywood directors who grew up, that's important, in the 1920s and the 1930s in America, meaning they grew up in the middle of a crisis, a huge economic crisis, like the one we had in Greece in the last 50 years and in other Mediterranean countries. It was a crisis in the US, and now, to a great extent, of banking institutions and big capital trying to squeeze everything out of the heads of people. Some of the directors that grew up very poor, impoverished, in the context of the 30s, the big crisis after the big crash, went back and made movies about this period that we don't care about in general, but we care about for the following reasons. Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, it doesn't get any more beautiful. Arthur Penn, the father of Sean Penn. Sean is leftist because his dad was leftist. Bonnie and Clyde, 1967. It's the story of a couple that starts being robbers of banks. They start their career here at a household in the western part of America. They don't even know how to shoot at the time. They start shooting, and let's see what's going on. That's a family that has lost its house to a bank.
But it's not anymore. Bank took it. Yes, sir, they moved us off. Now it belongs to them.
Well, that's a pitiful shame.
You damn.
The bank took the house. The family is getting ready to leave. The couple that would become people to rob banks are meeting them, and they start having this conversation. Arthur Penn keeps coming back to a certain thing, the household that made these people independent, and what do we see behind? A wind structure. It's a symbol of the former independence.
I'm right, man.
Again,
Me and him put in the years here. Yes, sir. You all go right ahead. We just come by for a last look. Y'all mind?
How many households in the western part of the United States only, meaning people in farms, had independence, a wind structure like this, the number in the context of the first part from the late 19th century to the 1940s is about 5 million. How many households had wind electricity in the 1920s and 1930s? That's even more interesting. Because if you had wind electricity a century ago in the United States, you could have radio, okay? You could have basic electric appliances, refrigerator. You could have nowadays computer and everything that you want. And these people had this. How many? 500,000. Which means 2.5 million people, larger than Slovenia, were enjoying the benefits of wind electricity without being connected to the grid. I'm saying this as an historian, but you can see the policy implications here. Okay? How were these 500,000 wind electricity structures removed? Why would a farmer like this guy would remove this and connect to the grid? How did this happen? Does anybody know what the enclosures were in the UK? The enclosures in the UK was, in England, in order for capitalism to start, in order for workers to appear, to have no other choice than becoming workers and go and knock the door at the Manchester factories, they would have first to have no other way to survive. Up to then, they had a way to survive. They would go in the public lands, the lands left from nobility, and cultivate there enough to be able to sustain them. And then the police was sent by force to enclose the public lands, the phenomenon of enclosures. And it was only then that people became workers working 14 hours, 16 hours per day in Manchester under terrible environmental conditions. Marx calls this the primitive accumulation that always goes in hand with accumulation proper. That's another story. Same story here. In the 1940s, none of these 500,000 owners wanted to have his wind structure removed, but it was removed by the police and the army in the United States. It was enclosures, as simple as that. Many similar stories in various parts of Earth, from Australia to some European countries. That was the important part. Let's quickly just so that we document that there were actually a strong tradition. Again, doesn't get any better. Elizabeth Taylor at her prime, James Dean, Rock Hudson, The Giant, 1956.
What do we do?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay.
It's a story of what's going on in the US South Texas before there was fossil fuel in Texas. And you can see the movie, that's my interpretation. I'm working on writing something about, I've written something about it actually, on the transition from this being a civilization based on wind to a civilization based at the same grounds on oil extractivism. The whole movie can be seen like this. Let's actually not see it, let's save our time for something else, but there are some scenes here. And finally, Once Upon a Time in the West, 1969, Charles Bronson, Henry Fonda, Claudia Cardinale. Henry Fonda at his prime. Claudia Cardinale, as beautiful as it can be. The bad guys are the three ones. The good guy is Charles Bronson. He arrives by train to kill James Fonda, who killed his family when he was a boy. He sends these three bad guys. There is a fight scene. Late 19th. He doesn't die. Good guys don't die that easily. And in the scene, there is one of the 5 million minimum wind apparatus that I mentioned before that were used as wind pumps. 5 million, which here is being used by the director because the turning of the wheel is the beginning of the narrative. And then one very artistic German movie, Werner Herzog, Signs of Life, 1968. This I would like for us to see. No sound is needed. It's a picture of Greece, the plateau of Lassithi in Crete, Greece. From 1920 to 1970, this is a group of German soldiers. After World War II, they survived and they wandered around the island after the war. And at this point, they go to the Lassithi plateau. And what do we see at the time? It's the only video that I was able to find of this, thanks to this wonderful German director. No less than 12,000 wind structures, which combine the traditional sails of Greek windmills with simple local materials, wood and some iron, in order to pump, again, water from the ground, which changed the whole area and the cultivation and brought prosperity to the Lassithi Plateau. They were only moved in the 1970s after a very strong propaganda for electric motors. No reason was necessary for this, and nowadays they lament it because if this was there in Crete, then Crete would have 10 times more tourists than it already does, which is a lot. All these were historical alternatives from the existence of these things. How much did it cost for one to buy a wind electricity structure like this, made from local materials, recyclable materials, able to repair it locally? The main actors there and now, from a Greek island to Slovenia to anywhere, could be local technicians, from plumbers to electricians to everybody, controlled locally. The price was about the same as buying a Model T Ford car. Not free, but something that you could afford. That's how these 500,000 people bought them. The colleague said earlier about the in my backyard movement. That's an in my backyard movement because people love to take pictures in front of them. Unlike the big wind farms, which we don't want in our backyard, people would love to show here they are getting married, here they show that they have one, again they have one. It was a symbol, as we saw in the movie, of independence and prosperity. Let's put it more properly conceptually. Ownership of the means of energy production. An advertisement. Now, were they good, or are you telling us stories about some primitive things? In the 1930s, there were cars, there were even airplanes. Here you can see that the propeller is a helicopter propeller. How good were they, these wind electricity structures? They put one in the northern pole and several in Africa for testing. They're still running. And that's 100 years ago. You can imagine what kind of miracles could be done today with small-scale structures of this kind. Recall the long-distance transmission network? What is the technical opposite to that? Local storage. When there is no wind or there is no electricity. Evidently, by the 1920s, there were storage electric devices, batteries, that were very fine, very sustainable, very, very, very. I'm not advocating the use of batteries in general, and we now know how problematic some materials used in batteries are. I'm only mentioning this by way of showing that local storage was technically feasible, just as it still is. Now, the means is a different story. We will see one more example. And let's not forget this story. What are these? Very small, tiny wind turbines. To do what? To take your computer, go out there on the mountains of Slovenia, have no electricity connection, have just one of these, plug it, and charge your computer. At the time, they were charging anything from Zenit. Zenit was a giant of electric manufacturing, from radios to telegraphs, very much used around the earth. So there was a tradition, a very strong tradition of wind energy. I made all this introduction of purpose to argue that parallel to fossil fuels, there was a strong tradition of wind energy. But all this tradition was lost, and so was lost its most important feature. Look at the left. This, I think, is San Francisco. Two ladies on their Sunday clothes climbing up the wind structure and posing to get a picture with it. Unlike present-day wind turbines, these were open structures, whereas ours are black boxed, closed. There we see another technical difference. The difference between long-distance transmission versus local storage is usually a difference between open structures and closed structures. Open structures show everything that there is. Closed structures point to you the turbine, they call the advertisement with a little girl, but they conceal all these apparatus, all this long-distance transmission network that is out there. So when the energy crisis hit in the 1970s, Germany, the US, Denmark invested heavily on what? Not the tradition, the interwar tradition of individual, small-scale, locally manufactured turbines, but constructing a wind turbine that's from the 70s and 80s as high as possible, as giant as possible. A wonderful colleague, Danish historian of technology by the name of Matthias Heyman, wrote a beautiful article calling this sign of hubris. They were trying to build at the laboratory so big wind turbines against the classical paradigm of sustainable small household level wind turbines that most of them were breaking and never took off. But it left a tradition of this. The tradition of small-scale decentralized is lost in Europe. There are other places that still exist, and that's important. But in Europe and in the US, the dominant paradigm is conflating all variations, all versions of wind energy, and presenting this, the huge 180 by now 233 meter. That's taller than any New York skyscraper. And that's from a proposal to put 150 of them on the top of the small island of Icaria. Okay? There are proposals, and there are actually plans for implementation of these kinds in Greece. Greece is a paradigmatic case because of the many islands and the many remote locations. It was very expensive to maintain local thermonuclear stations, local thermoelectric stations. So if there was a place on Earth in the 70s and the 80s that it would be competitive to install wind energy, it would have been this. However, in the 70s and the 80s, we'll see more of this, nobody was talking about big ones. They were talking about small ones that would be for local production and local use to replace the electricity, the thermoelectric station. But the modern versions, and the one that followed, especially after the dominance of neoliberal capitalism, has been big wind farms destroying mountains and islands in order to export the electricity to the mainland grid at any cost. $1 billion to build an underwater cable in the Aegean. I think it would be 20 billion and it will never be built because the Aegean is not like the Baltic Sea. It's like this. But that's another story. Keep the fact that this is a completely different paradigm. It's production for long-distance transmission. How much of this would Icaria get, the island of Icaria get? Zero. Because it's a myth that this wind electricity can be channeled to the island as well. No. the apparatus, the technology needed to make this production compatible with a local transmission network is not there, and the companies just don't care about it. One more point. Who controls this? Where do these materials come from? Extraction in the third world, according to the old extractivist regime. My colleague mentions today that it's a different extractivist model. Yes, it's a different extractivist model. You extract mostly solid materials and not a fuel or liquid, gas or oil. But all the materials, they are either synthetic. How can you have a structure 180 meters tall without the materials being of a special kind? And this cannot be produced by local technicians. The monopoly here is worse, the world monopoly, than with nuclear energy. The manufacturers who control it are fewer, 3 of them. Okay? And then for the turbines, the material, again, comes from the third world, special materials to be able to tolerate these pressures. Okay? They put them up there in Ikaria. How long will they stay there? 20, maximum 25. What happens next? Nobody knows. All kinds of environmental impact assessment studies that I happen to look at, there is actually a person writing here, PhD on this in Greece, the companies never commit to what they will do afterwards in Greece and anywhere in Europe and anywhere on Earth. They just say one day, I've seen such a study, one day these will become wonderful industrial archaeology monuments. Huh? How about that? And there is an architecture professor, don't want to say much about his integrity, who actually signed this. As of now, we don't know what's going to happen with them. I'm not mentioning all kinds of traditional. So you can see the juxtaposition. Huge structures for long-distance transmission, materials that are not local, are not recyclable, closed structures, mixing up in the context of the long-distance transmission of the nuclear fuel and all the other fossil fuel-produced electrons with what is produced here. And the ideology is, oh, it's wind or it's solar. The colleague also mentioned, that was very nice, the desert tech concept earlier today. To bring from Africa, endless reservoir Africa is, amounts of solar electricity to Europe. How? There was a German, the Anthropa project. You may want to check it out. There's a whole wonderful book. Some Germans thought about it in the interwar period to construct a dam at the Gibraltar in order to turn the whole Mediterranean into a hydro dam for electricity for Northern Europe. It was never implemented. For the same reason that this plan for desert tech, to have huge solar plants in Africa, without asking the Africans, without, let's say that it was to be done for the good of mankind and the protection, the transition to a renewable energy. Why was it never built? Because there is no long-distance transmission network. That's the expensive part. Now, desert tech, interestingly, was transformed into Project Helios. It was imported in Greece when? 2009. What happened in Greece in 2008, 2009? A debt of Greeks to private institutions like banks was transformed into, without the Greeks willing to do this, into a debt to countries. So the risk that some people took in the private sector, like banks, was no longer a risk. They were paid their money, and the Greeks, from that point on, they owed to the Germans, to the Slovenians, to whoever. But that was not given, that it should have been like this. When you make an investment, you run the risk of losing. Someone at exactly this conjuncture had the idea of rebaptizing Project Desert Tech into Project Helios. And the idea was that huge solar plants would be installed in Greece to feed Germany and the other countries of Northern Europe with renewable, sustainable electricity. One problem. You have to cross the Balkans, you have to cross seas in order to do this, and that's a huge investment. It lasted 1 year. They even put it down, I know it because I supervised the dissertation on this, they even put it down in the memorandums of agreements between EU and Greece. Shameless, because they knew there is literature out there that says technically it's not feasible to do this. Was this a renewable, sustainable energy project? I don't think so. Pictures from the neo-extractivist regimes. You extract all these materials from all around the earth, just like you were extracting uranium to build these huge structures. Let's go to something, because we need a little hope to conclude with this. Again, our island of Icaria. A very symbolic case, I think, because you may recall that according to the myth of Icarus, that's when up in the air from the island of Icaria, someone thought that he could fly, use technology to fly, and fell and was killed. The myth of Icarus and Daedalus. Icaria takes the name from this, so there is technology involved here. This island was also the bedside of a big experiment in the last 40 years, a very simple experiment. You take one place on the island and you build 2 small dams, small, not huge, water and water. And then you put 2 wind turbines, not very big, but not very small either. When there is wind, these 2 wind turbines can feed with electricity the island. When there is no wind, they pump up water from the lower one to the one that is at the upper level. And then when there is no wind, this works as hydroelectricity. How much can this cover? 40%, 49% of the needs of the island. So with 2 of them, you can make the island independent. Doesn't it have a local environmental impact? Of course, you build something. But it's nowhere near this. How long did it take to finish? 40 years. 40 years. Cost? I think the original cost was about 15 million euros, not much. There is this and another island in Spain that the EU has experimented with this. There was so much sabotage on this idea in order to promote the other one that it took 40 years to finish. I think that's the way to go. That's the way to go. The smallest scale possible, local material, decentralized. Can Athens be a city of 5 million people in a country of 10 million people with these things? Of course not. But Athens is the product of an energy regime that is killing the environment and absorbs all resources from everywhere on the country in order to survive. Of course you need a different society. Of course you need organization around care. To local storage, you don't want to overspend, you want to make sure that you care in case there is no wind tomorrow. That's a world organized around care of energy technologies, not a world organized around profit from long-distance transmission. Keep one thing from all this thing, that the technical details matter. It's a different thing to have an energy community around this, and it's a different thing to have an energy community around this. Everything will be different. Of course, I will not bake the future and tell you, I'm only, after all, an historian, a technology policy person. I cannot tell you exactly what is best around the Earth. I may just conclude by saying that there is a network called Wind Empowerment Network. You may want to check it. I actually sent a PDF to the organizers. And together with a colleague who works as an engineer at the Polytechnic Institute of Athens, we have written something about how this network and how people around the Earth, just as we speak, in so-called third world countries, are living with small wind turbines built with assistance and instruction from this wind empowerment network as open source structures. This community, including my friend, the engineer, the co-author of the article, is actually sharing information on how to adjust and localize these wind turbines. My friend and everybody else in the network travels around from Nepal to Mexico to to instruct people how to build these small structures, at least once or twice until they learn it. So there are alternatives. And in the third world, there are real alternatives of small-scale energy structures. I sent to the organizers a chapter that I recently co-authored on exactly the topic that I talked about today, technological black boxing versus ecological reparation, from encased, concealed black box industrial to open renewable wind energy. And here is another article with the engineer that I mentioned, Kostas Latoufis. He has been everywhere, seriously, from Nepal to Mexico to many places in Greece to help construct small wind structures. And this is a study this is an article that we wrote about a place in Scotland where an alternative technology movement community going back in the 70s is energy independent through wind turbines, small ones, which it builds from scratch. It goes to the garbage and collects the materials that it needs to construct them. These are the two articles that I mentioned. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion. Because on the top of everything else, we need a battle for concepts. That's why I've been doing, I spent 2/3 of my presentation on purpose, trying to sensitize you all to how important concepts are here. If you talk about renewable energy sources, then how can I go there and say that the 150 wind turbines on the island of Vicaria are not just sources? They are specific material structures. Why is this obscure, as in the case of Argentina? Why can people conflate two different things in Argentina? Promote industrial wind turbines by pointing to the tradition of the wind pumps to feed the animals? Because of concepts. I'm not saying it's only concepts, but I'm adding the concepts in order to show how difficult this struggle is. Yet at the same time, and we would have no chance of changing the situation. But there is one reason that we stand a chance, and we are going to do our best, your generation in particular. The environmental crisis. Things are so bad. Who would listen to me and my stories from Hollywood if it wasn't from the fact that Greece is burning right now? And it's not burning because of me, it's burning because of a certain way of producing the social technically. It's only because of the crisis, unfortunately, that this type of things are being funded, scholarly research is being funded. There are all these kinds of organizations like the Wind Empowerment Network that I mentioned before, that there is a chance. But this struggle, and struggle it is, because you go against immense interest, is a struggle that is so difficult. We don't even have the vocabulary to talk about it.